Evelyn Shaw was exactly the kind of woman the world was designed to ignore. At 48 years old, she had mastered the art of being entirely invisible. Dressed in faded, slightly oversized hospital-issue blue scrubs, her graying hair pulled back into a messy utilitarian bun, she looked like just another weary agency nurse. On paper, she was a mid-level float nurse, assigned to restock the supply carts and handle the mundane logistical overflow in Trauma Bay 1 at Chicago Presbyterian Hospital. She liked the quiet. She liked the sterile, predictable hum of the air conditioning, the crisp smell of industrial bleach, and the soft, rhythmic beeping of the civilian heart monitors. It was a stark, comforting contrast to the life she had left behind, a life measured in the deafening roar of Black Hawk helicopters, the suffocating heat of the desert, and the frantic, blood-soaked urgency of war. "Excuse me, nurse." The sharp, impatient voice belonged to Dr. Julian Vance, the hospital's chief of trauma. Vance was 35, brilliant, and wore a customized, tailored lab coat that probably cost more than Evelyn's monthly rent. He was a man who operated in pristine, brightly lit surgical theaters, heavily reliant on millions of dollars of diagnostic equipment. Evelyn didn't look up from her clipboard. "Yes, Dr. Vance?" "The intubation trays in Bay 3 are missing the pediatric blades. I need them stocked now," Vance snapped, checking his $10,000 wristwatch. "We are a Level 1 trauma center, not a walk-in clinic. Let's try to maintain some standard of excellence." "Already moved to Bay 2 for the incoming asthma protocol, doctor," Evelyn replied, her voice flat, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion. "I restocked Bay 3's backups 5 minutes ago. They're in the second drawer." Vance blinked, momentarily irritated that he couldn't berate her further. He gave a dismissive scoff, turning on his heel. "Just see that it stays that way. Leave the clinical thinking to the medical staff." Evelyn simply nodded, returning to her inventory. Let him have his ego. She had spent 15 years pulling shattered soldiers out of burning wreckage under heavy enemy fire. The arrogance of a civilian surgeon in a climate-controlled room didn't even register on her pulse. Then, the floor shook. It wasn't a gentle vibration. It was a concussive, deep-tissue rumble that rattled the stainless steel instruments on their trays and caused the overhead fluorescent lights to flicker violently. Evelyn's head snapped up, her posture instantly changed. The slight, weary slump of her shoulders vanished, replaced by rigid, terrifyingly perfect stillness. Her eyes darted toward the ambulance bay doors. Not an earthquake, her mind calculated instantly. Explosive ordnance, C4 or Semtex, less than 2 miles away. Before the other nurses could even gasp, the overlapping wail of sirens ripped through the city air. But this wasn't the standard rhythmic EMS. It was the aggressive, chaotic screech of heavily armored vehicles running multiple red lights. Tires squealed violently outside the ambulance bay. The heavy double doors to the ER were practically kicked off their hinges. A wave of chaos exploded into the pristine trauma center. Men in torn, dust-covered suits and heavy tactical vests spilled into the room. They were covered in pulverized concrete and soot, screaming at the top of their lungs. Their earpieces dangled loosely from their collars. "Clear the bay! Clear the damn bay right now!" the lead agent roared, his voice cracking with panic. He was dragging a collapsible military field stretcher alongside 2 other frantic agents. "We need a trauma surgeon! We were hit! The motorcade was hit!" The ER erupted into a frenzy. Nurses screamed, orderlies froze. Dr. Vance rushed out of his glass-walled office, his pristine demeanor shattered by the sudden influx of tactical personnel. "I'm the chief of trauma. Stand down and let my people work," Vance yelled, trying to project authority over the screaming agents. He pointed a shaking finger at the patient on the table. "Get him to table 1. Someone page neuro and get the CT scanner warmed up." From the shadows of the supply closet, Evelyn took one look at the patient. It was a catastrophic blast injury. The man on the table was pale, his lips tinged blue, taking rapid, shallow gasps of air. His chest was expanding unevenly. Vance and his team swarmed the table, cutting away the man's shredded Kevlar vest. "His pressure is tanking, 60/40. a panicked resident yelled. "He's in hypovolemic shock," Vance barked, his eyes wide as he looked at a superficial shrapnel wound on the man's leg. "Push 2 liters of saline, rapid infuser. Get me a central line kit. We need to pump him full of fluids before we move him to the scanner." Evelyn's blood ran cold. "He's not in hypovolemic shock," Evelyn realized, her eyes locking on the distended veins in the patient's neck and the absent movement on the left side of his chest. "It's a massive tension pneumothorax, complicated by internal blast hemorrhage. If Vance pushed 2 liters of fluid under pressure, he would drown the remaining heart function in seconds. The patient would be dead before the IV line was even secured." Evelyn dropped her clipboard. The quiet, invisible nurse was gone. The heavy plastic clipboard hit the linoleum floor with a sharp crack, but the sound was completely swallowed by the shrieking alarms in Trauma Bay 1. Evelyn Shaw moved. She didn't run. Running induced panic. She utilized the fast, predatory glide she had perfected in black site triage tents from Kandahar to Mogadishu. She slipped through the frantic ring of civilian nurses and residents who were practically tripping over each other. "I want that rapid infuser online now!" Dr. Julian Vance screamed, his voice pitching up an octave as he fumbled with the packaging of a central line kit. Sweat beaded on his pristine forehead. "And get me an airway. He's hypoxic. I need to tube him." "Doctor, look at his neck." A calm, chillingly steady voice cut through the screaming. Vance snapped his head up, startled. Evelyn was standing directly across the stainless steel table from him, her eyes locked on the dying man. "Nurse Shaw? What the hell are you doing in the sterile field?" Vance barked, his face flushing red with anger. "Get out of the way. We have a crashing VIP." "You're misdiagnosing him, doctor," Evelyn said, her voice carrying an unnatural, ice-cold authority that briefly silenced the 2 residents next to her. She pointed a gloved finger at the patient's throat. "Pronounced jugular venous distension, tracheal deviation to the right, absent breath sounds on the left side. It's not hypovolemia from the leg wound. It's a massive tension pneumothorax, secondary to blast overpressure. His left lung has collapsed, and the trapped air is crushing his heart." The lead tactical agent, hovering inches behind Vance, grabbed the surgeon's shoulder. "What is she talking about? Fix him. The director needs this man alive." Vance violently shoved the agent's hand away and glared at Evelyn. "I do not need a glorified supply clerk giving me a diagnostic consult. I am the chief of trauma. His pressure's dropping because he's bleeding out from the shrapnel wound. If we don't restore his fluid volume, he will code. If you push 2 liters of saline into a heart that can't pump because of thoracic pressure, you will put him into irreversible cardiac arrest," Evelyn countered, her eyes narrowing. She stepped closer, invading Vance's space. "Do not push those fluids. You need to decompress his chest, now. A 14-gauge needle, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line." For a second, Vance hesitated. The confidence radiating off this mousy, gray-haired woman was completely destabilizing, but his ego, heavily fortified by years of civilian accolades, violently rejected her. "Security?" Vance roared, pointing a trembling finger at Evelyn. "Get this woman out of my trauma bay right now. You are fired, Shaw. Do you hear me? Fired." 2 civilian healthcare security guards, already in the room from the chaotic arrival, stepped forward, looking unsure. "Doctor," the head respiratory therapist called out frantically, holding a laryngoscope, "I can't get an airway. His vocal cords are completely clamped and his oxygen saturation is dropping, 72% and falling." "Then push the paralytics and force it," Vance yelled, losing all composure. He turned back to the IV pole. "Start the rapid infuser, wide open." "No!" Evelyn shouted, reaching across the table to grab the IV line, but a heavy hand seized her shoulder. It was one of the tactical agents, his face pale and desperate, trusting the man with the chief title on his badge. "Back off, lady," the agent grunted, physically yanking Evelyn 2 steps away from the table. "Let the doctor work." Evelyn didn't fight the agent. She simply watched, her jaw clenching as the cold, hard mathematics of battlefield trauma played out exactly as she knew it would. The resident opened the valve on the rapid infuser. Thick, clear saline rushed into the dying man's veins under pressure. It took exactly 4 seconds for the catastrophic failure. The heart monitor, which had been weakly thumping at a rate of 140 beats per minute, suddenly spiked into a chaotic, erratic scribble. Then a long, piercing, continuous tone echoed through the trauma bay. Beep. "He's in V-fib," a nurse screamed in pure terror. "We lost his pulse." "Paddles!" Vance shrieked, his eyes wide with sheer panic as his particular protocol completely disintegrated. "Charge to 200 joules." "Defibrillation won't work on pulseless electrical activity caused by a mechanical obstruction," Evelyn said. Her voice was no longer a warning, it was a death knell. Vance slammed the paddles onto the man's chest. "Clear?" The patient's body jerked. The monitor remained a flat, damning line. "Clear?" Vance screamed again, sheer terror vibrating in his voice as he realized he had just killed one of the most important men in the country. The tactical agents drew their weapons, screaming into their radios, transforming the ER into a powder keg. Vance froze, the paddles shaking in his hands, completely paralyzed by his catastrophic failure. The patient had 90 seconds before his brain died. Evelyn Shaw took a slow, deep breath. The quiet civilian was dead. Archangel Zero was awake. The flatline hummed, a shrill, unending electronic scream of total failure. Dr. Julian Vance stood completely paralyzed, the defibrillator paddles hovering inches above the dying man's chest. His eyes were wide, vacant, and terrified. Around him, the pristine Trauma Bay 1 dissolved into total anarchy. The lead tactical agent had his sidearm half-drawn, screaming frantically into his wrist microphone for an evacuation that would never arrive in time. 2 surgical residents were frozen in shock, watching the monitor's damning horizontal line. Evelyn Shaw moved. The tactical agent who had previously yanked her away from the table still had a loose, warning grip on the shoulder of her scrub top. In a blur of calculated, economic motion, Evelyn rotated her body, executing a flawless, low-profile wrist lock. She didn't break his arm. She just applied enough agonizing pressure to the joint to make his knees buckle instantly. The massive man gasped, releasing her as he dropped to one knee, his hand flying to his wrist in shock. Before the other agents could even process the takedown of their point man, Evelyn was already at the head of the stainless steel table. "Get away from him," Vance finally stammered, his panic turning to rage. He dropped one paddle to grab her arm. "I said you're fired. Security, get her." Evelyn didn't speak. She didn't yell. She delivered a sharp, open-handed palm strike directly to the center of Vance's chest. It wasn't a lethal blow, but it carried enough precise kinetic force to knock the wind completely out of the arrogant surgeon. Vance gasped, stumbling backward until he crashed into a heavy rolling tray of surgical instruments. The deafening clatter of metal hitting the linoleum floor echoed like a gunshot. "Quiet the room!" Evelyn roared. It wasn't the soft, accommodating voice of a tired inventory nurse. It was a terrifying, weaponized command voice. It was a voice forged in the blistering, blood-soaked dust of Helmand Province, designed to cut through the deafening roar of Apache roaders, incoming mortar fire, and pure human panic. It carried the absolute, crushing weight of a commanding officer. The sheer acoustic force of it froze every single person in Trauma Bay 1. Even the shrieking flatline seemed to recede into the background. The second tactical agent snapped out of his daze and raised his weapon, aiming the muzzle of his Glock directly at Evelyn's chest. "Step away from the director, now!" he screamed, his hands shaking violently. "Get on the ground!" Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't even raise her hands. She locked eyes with the agent over the dying man's body, her gaze cold, flat, and utterly devoid of fear. "Your VIP has exactly 40 seconds before irreversible anoxic brain injury. His heart is being crushed by trapped air because that idiot pushed fluids into a closed box. If you shoot me, he dies. If you arrest me, he dies. Holster your weapon and secure those doors, or you're going to explain to the President of the United States why you let his primary asset expire on a civilian table." The agent hesitated, the gun wavering. The absolute, unshakable certainty in her eyes broke him. He swallowed hard and slowly lowered the weapon, taking a step back to guard the shattered double doors. Evelyn didn't wait for his permission. She turned her back on the gun, treating it as entirely irrelevant, and seized total command of the airspace.
"You," she snapped at a terrified resident, pointing a betadine-stained glove at him. "Kill that rapid infuser immediately. Shut it off now." The resident scrambled to obey, slamming the heavy plastic valve shut. "You," she turned to the head respiratory therapist, whose hands were trembling over the patient's face. "Drop the laryngoscope. His airway is crushed from the deviation. You'll never tube him from the top. Prepare a number 8 endotracheal tube, bag valve mask, and stand by to bag him on my mark." She reached across the sterile field, grabbing a heavy scalpel and a set of trauma shears with terrifying familiarity. "Vance," she said, her voice a whip crack that made the chief of trauma jump as he wheezed on the floor. "Get off your ass, get over here, and hold this man's right arm down. He's going to flail when I relieve the pressure." You can't do this," Vance stammered, clutching his chest, his pristine lab coat stained with floor wax. "This is assault. This is a gross violation of medical protocol. I will have you—" "I am the only thing keeping your patient out of a body bag," Evelyn interrupted coldly, her eyes scanning the man's chest to lock onto the anatomical landmarks. "Shut your mouth, do exactly as I say, and try to keep up." She positioned the cold steel of the scalpel over the patient's throat. The clock was at 20 seconds. It was time to go to work.
The flatline was a physical weight in the room, pressing down on the terrified medical staff. Evelyn Shaw ignored it. The scalpel in her right hand didn't tremble. It was an extension of her own absolute will. "He has no pulse," Dr. Vance rasped, his hands hovering uselessly over the patient's arm. "You can't cut a dead man." "He is in PEA. The heart wants to beat, but the pressure won't let it," Evelyn fired back, her eyes locked on the patient's neck. She abandoned the traditional, delicate surgical approach Vance would have taken. There was no time for sterile drapes, betadine scrubs, or local anesthetic. This was combat medicine. Evelyn's left index finger slid down the patient's throat, forcefully palpating the thyroid cartilage to locate the cricothyroid membrane. "Cricothyroidotomy. I am bypassing the upper airway obstruction." With a single hyper-efficient motion, she dragged the scalpel in a small vertical line, followed instantly by a horizontal puncture. It was a textbook, flawless tactical airway maneuver. She didn't wait for the terrified resident to hand her a tool to open the site. She simply shoved the blunt end of the scalpel handle into the incision and twisted it 90 degrees to hold the airway open. "Bougie, now!" she commanded. The respiratory therapist, operating entirely on adrenaline and Evelyn's gravitational pull, slapped the flexible plastic guide wire into her waiting hand. Evelyn threaded it blindly into the trachea by pure muscle memory, slid the number 8 endotracheal tube over the wire, and pulled the scalpel free. "Attach the bag valve mask and squeeze, 1 breath every 6 seconds, she ordered. "Do not overinflate." The therapist squeezed the bag. The patient's right lung expanded, but the left remained rigidly inflated, trapping the heart. The monitor continued to scream its continuous, unbroken tone. "We have an airway, but the tension pneumothorax is still crushing his heart," Evelyn shouted, dropping the scalpel. She extended a bloodied, gloved hand toward the frozen surgical resident. 14-gauge needle. Give it to me." The resident fumbled the plastic casing, practically dropping it into her palm. She didn't even look at it. She ripped the cap off with her teeth and spat it onto the floor. She found the second intercostal space on the mid-clavicular line of the patient's chest. Without a millisecond of hesitation, she drove the 3-inch needle directly into the chest cavity. A loud, incredibly distinct hiss echoed through the trauma bay, the sound of highly pressurized trapped air aggressively escaping the pleural space. Every eye in the room darted to the monitor. For 2 agonizing seconds, the flatline held. Then a jagged, chaotic spike broke the line. Then another. Then a steady, rhythmic, beautiful cascade of green mountain peaks filled the screen. Beep, 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 beep. "Sinus tachycardia," the resident whispered, his jaw physically dropping. We have a pulse. He has a pulse." "Don't celebrate yet. His pressure is still in the basement," snapped Evelyn, shifting her focus instantly to the shrapnel wound on the patient's upper thigh. The blast had torn into the groin, right at the crease of the hip. It's a high junctional bleed. A tourniquet won't sit high enough to stop the femoral flow.
She locked eyes with the chief of trauma, who was staring at the heart monitor as if it were a magic trick. "Vance!" Evelyn barked, her voice cracking like a rifle shot. "Snap out of it. I need your hands right here, right now." Vance flinched, snapping his head toward her. He looked completely lost, a general stripped of his rank. What do you need?" "I need you to act like a doctor." Evelyn reached into the trauma cart and ripped open a package of hemostatic agent combat gauze. She shoved the chemically treated roll into the Vance's immaculate, trembling hands. "It's a deep arterial junctional bleed. I need you to pack this wound. You do not lay it on top. You shove that gauze deep into the cavity until it hits the severed artery, and then you apply 200 pounds of direct, unrelenting pressure. Do it." Vance fell to his knees beside the table. Stripped of his arrogance and terrified by the raw authority radiating from the unassuming nurse, he obeyed blindly. He pushed the hemostatic gauze deep into the wound, burying his hands in the trauma, and leaned his entire body weight onto his palms. "Hold it. Don't let up for 3 minutes or he bleeds out on the floor," Evelyn instructed, her voice finally dropping from a tactical scream to a low, intense hum. She stepped back from the table. The patient's chest rose and fell evenly. The monitor beeped with a strong, stabilizing rhythm. The impossible had just been accomplished in less than 60 seconds. The room was dead silent, save for the rhythmic sounds of the life support machines. The tactical agents stared at Evelyn, their weapons completely forgotten, their mouths slightly open in absolute disbelief. Vance slowly looked up from his bloodied hands, his pristine lab coat ruined. He stared at Evelyn Shaw, the mousy, invisible inventory nurse, with a mixture of pure terror and profound awe. Before Vance could even formulate the question burning in his mind, the heavy sound of a synchronized multi-ton vehicle convoy vibrated through the floorboards, accompanied by the distinct rhythmic thud of a military Black Hawk helicopter descending directly onto the hospital roof.
The deafening, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the Black Hawk's rotors vibrated through the reinforced concrete of the hospital ceiling, shaking loose a fine layer of dust over the pristine surgical lights of Trauma Bay 1. Down on the floor, Dr. Julian Vance was still kneeling in a pool of blood and betadine, his hands clamped desperately over the patient's femoral artery. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically between his ruined designer lab coat and the steady, beautiful green peaks on the heart monitor. Evelyn Shaw stood over him, completely unbothered by the sheer magnitude of what had just occurred. She calmly peeled off her bloodied latex gloves, dropping them into a biohazard bin with a soft, dismissive smack. "3 minutes are up, Doctor," Evelyn said, her voice returning to its quiet, flat baseline. "The hemostatic agent has bonded. You can ease off the pressure. The bleeding is controlled." Vance slowly lifted his hands. The wound was packed tight. The catastrophic bleeding had stopped. He looked up at Evelyn, his face a twisting mask of profound humiliation, shock, and rising defensive anger. "You!" Vance stammered, his voice trembling as he struggled to his feet. He pointed a blood-stained finger at her. "You assaulted a physician. You performed an unauthorized surgical airway without a medical license. You assaulted federal agents. I don't care that you got lucky. You are going to a federal penitentiary for the rest of your life." The lead tactical agent, currently nursing a severely sprained wrist from Evelyn's flawless takedown, stepped forward. He didn't look angry. He looked deeply unnerved. He had spent 10 years in the service, and he knew a trained killer when he saw one. "Nobody is moving," the agent commanded, though his voice lacked its previous bravado. He kept a very cautious distance from Evelyn. The Director of National Intelligence was just targeted in a coordinated strike. Until the extraction team secures this perimeter, everyone in this room is a suspect, including you, lady. Evelyn didn't even look at him. She turned her back to the armed agent and walked toward the small staff cubby in the corner of the trauma bay. "I stabilized your asset," Evelyn said over her shoulder, her voice laced with absolute apathy. "His airway is secure, his lung is decompressed, and his pressure is holding at 110/70. My shift ended 10 minutes ago. I'm going home." "Are you insane?" Vance shrieked, his voice cracking as he grabbed a clean towel to wipe his hands. "You are not leaving this room. Security, restrain her."
The two hospital security guards, who had been plastered against the wall in sheer terror for the last 5 minutes, didn't move a single muscle. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the mousy, gray-haired woman who had just manhandled a federal agent and effortlessly hijacked a level 1 trauma room. Evelyn reached into the cubby and grabbed her worn olive-drab canvas duffel bag. As she yanked it from the tight shelf, the zipper caught on the metal grating. With a sharp rip, the side pocket tore open. A small, heavy object fell onto the linoleum floor with a sharp metallic clink. It didn't bounce. It landed flat, sliding perfectly across the slick floor until it stopped directly at the boots of the lead tactical agent. The room went dead silent. The agent looked down. It wasn't a civilian nurse's badge. It was a solid, matte black titanium card, slightly thicker than a standard ID. There was no name, no photograph, and no hospital logo. Instead, etched into the dark metal was the gold, heavily classified seal of the Joint Special Operations Command, JOSOC. Beneath it, in stark block lettering, were 3 lines of text that made the agent's blood run entirely cold. Department of Defense, Extreme Risk Clearance, Joint Medical Augmentation Unit, Tier 1. Call sign, Archangel 0. The agent slowly picked up the heavy titanium card. His hands, which had been perfectly steady during the explosive ambush on the motorcade, began to shake. He looked from the card to the unassuming gray-haired woman in the oversized blue scrubs. What is this? The agent whispered as all the color drained from his face. This clearance level, this doesn't officially exist. Joint Medical Augmentation is a ghost unit. They're a myth. Dr. Vance scoffed loudly, marching over to look at the card. What are you talking about? It's probably some fake novelty garbage. She's a float nurse. I want her in handcuffs immediately. Before the agent could tell the arrogant surgeon to shut his mouth, the heavy double doors of the ER didn't just open, they were violently breached. Clear the fatal funnel. Move, move. A booming, tactical voice echoed down the hallway. A dozen men flooded the corridor. They weren't civilian police, and they weren't Secret Service suits. They were elite operators. Heavily armored, carrying suppressed short-barreled rifles, their faces obscured by panoramic night vision goggles and black balaclavas. Behind them, marching with absolute terrifying authority, was a 2-star United States Army general flanked by 2 men in crisp black suits. The real authorities had arrived, and Julian Vance was about to demand they arrest the only person in the room who outranked them all.
The operators flooded Trauma Bay 1, moving with the eerie, synchronized silence of men who brought death for a living. They bypassed the stunned hospital security guards entirely, forming a rigid perimeter around the stabilized patient. Dr. Julian Vance, his pristine designer lab coat now a ruined canvas of blood and betadine, immediately puffed out his chest. His fragile ego, shattered over the last 10 minutes, desperately sought the protection of hierarchy. "General," Vance barked, stepping directly into the path of the towering 2-star Army general who had just walked through the breached doors. "I am Dr. Julian Vance, Chief of Trauma. Thank God you're here. This woman, this float nurse, just committed multiple federal felonies. She assaulted a federal agent, assaulted me, and performed a highly illegal, unsterile battlefield procedure on your VIP. I demand she be placed in federal custody immediately." The general, a man carved from granite with a chest full of ribbons, didn't even blink at the arrogant civilian. His ice-cold eyes swept past Vance's frantic gesturing, past the terrified medical residents, and past the stabilized patient on the table. His gaze locked onto the unassuming, gray-haired woman quietly zipping up her olive-drab canvas bag in the corner of the room. "General, did you hear me?" Vance shrieked, his voice bordering on hysterical as he pointed a shaking finger at Evelyn. "Arrest her." "Shut your mouth, doctor," the general rumbled. The sheer, crushing gravity of his voice instantly silenced the entire trauma bay. The general stepped around Vance as if the chief of trauma were nothing more than a misplaced piece of medical equipment. He walked directly toward the corner of the room. The elite, heavily armed operators immediately stepped back, clearing a wide path and snapping to attention. The general stopped 2 feet in front of Evelyn Shaw. The room held its collective breath. Vance waited for the order to put her in chains.
Instead, the two-star general straightened his posture, brought his hand up in a razor-sharp motion, and held a flawless, rigid salute. "Archangel Zero," the general said, his voice dropping its harsh edge, replaced with profound, unwavering reverence. "It is an absolute honor to see you again, ma'am." The silence that followed was absolute. It was so complete that the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor seemed deafening. Vance's jaw physically dropped. The lead tactical agent, still holding the matte black titanium JOC ID, went completely pale, his eyes wide with retroactive terror at the realization of who he had aggressively grabbed just moments earlier. Evelyn didn't salute back. She simply slung her worn canvas bag over her shoulder. "General Miller, you're losing your touch. It took your QRF 12 minutes to respond to a blast in the city center." "Traffic was a nightmare, ma'am," General Miller replied, without missing a beat, lowering his hand. He looked at the patient, then back to Evelyn. "We thought we lost him. The initial report said it was a fatal overpressure wound." "It was," Evelyn said flatly. "Your DNI is alive because I decompressed a tension pneumothorax and bypassed his crushed airway." She shot a cold sidewise glance at Vance. No thanks to the local talent, who almost drowned his heart in saline. Vance looked like he had been struck by lightning. "General, I don't understand," he stammered, his arrogant veneer completely dissolving into pathetic confusion. She's a supply nurse. She restocks the pediatric trays." The general finally turned to look at Vance, his eyes filled with absolute disdain. "She's Major Evelyn Shaw, doctor," the general stated, his voice echoing through the pristine ER. "Former lead surgical asset for the Joint Medical Augmentation Unit. She is the most highly decorated combat trauma specialist in the history of the United States Special Operations Command. She has deployed to 32 classified combat zones, pulled over 400 operators off the X under heavy enemy fire, and she wrote the literal textbook on the junctional hemorrhage protocol you just so ineptly attempted to execute." Vance took a staggering step back, all remaining blood draining from his face. The medical residents stared at the quiet, gray-haired woman with their mouths hanging open. The tactical agents swallowed hard, internally thanking God they hadn't pulled the trigger when they had their guns drawn on her. "She retired 3 years ago," the general continued, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft register. "And if I ever hear that you raised your voice to her again, doctor, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your career performing prostate exams at a research base in the Arctic Circle. Do we understand each other?" Vance couldn't speak. He just gave a frantic, humiliated nod, shrinking away into the sterile cabinetry. The general turned back to Evelyn. "Ma'am, the president's motorcade is awaiting outside. We'd be honored to give you an escort home. Or, if you're ready to come back to the unit, I have a team spinning up for—" "My shift is over, General," Evelyn interrupted gently, offering the faintest hint of a smile. "I have a bus to catch." Without another word, Evelyn Shaw turned and walked toward the exit. The elite Tier 1 operators parted like the Red Sea, bowing their heads slightly in deep respect as she passed. The invisible nurse walked out into the cool city night, leaving the arrogant experts of Chicago Presbyterian Hospital completely speechless, utterly humiliated, and standing in the awe-inspiring shadow of a legend.